everything we know, the signs were there. They were scattered across the mountains of Sinaloa like seeds nobody thought to water, hiding in plain sight inside a dirt floor home, in a boy's cracked hands, in a father's fist, in fields that smelled like earth and quiet desperation. The world would eventually come to know Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera as El Chapo, the most powerful drug trafficker on the planet, a man who built an empire so vast it stretched from the coca fields of South America to the street corners of Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. But that story didn't begin with tunnels or prison escapes or courtrooms packed with federal prosecutors. It began in a place most people have never heard of, with a child most people never would have looked at twice. Because here's what nobody wants to say out loud. The man who would eventually command an organization generating billions of dollars annually, who would embarrass two governments with consecutive prison escapes, who would be hunted for decades across mountains and jungle and border towns, didn't become that man overnight. He was made, slowly, quietly, through a combination of forces so ordinary they were almost invisible. Poverty and isolation and violence, and a world where the only economy that worked was the one operating outside the law. Long before the satellite phones and the tunnels and the DIA task forces, there was a boy in the Sierra Madre who was learning something that nobody was trying to teach him. He was learning how to survive. And the warning signs were there the entire time. This story isn't just about how El Chapo became a cartel boss. That's the version everyone already knows, the simplified headline that gets passed around without context. What this story is about is something more uncomfortable and more important. It's about how a series of overlooked moments that seemed small at the time, moments that happened thousands of miles from any courtroom or newspaper, gradually constructed one of the most dangerous human beings the modern world has ever produced. Every decision he made as an adult had a root somewhere in his childhood. Every empire he built was a shadow of lessons he learned before he was old enough to shave. And if anyone had been paying attention at the right time, they might have seen exactly where this was headed. Joaquin Guzman Loera was born sometime in the 1950s in a tiny hamlet called La Tuna, nestled deep within the municipality of Badiraguato, in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. His exact birth date remains disputed. Official documents have cited both April 4, 1957 and December 25, 1954. A detail that, in itself, tells you something about the world he came from. This was not a place that kept meticulous records. This was not a place where dates mattered much to the people living inside it. Before the world would come to know him by the nickname that meant Shorty, a nod to his compact 5'6" frame, he was simply another boy growing up in a corner of Mexico so remote that the government barely knew it existed. There were no real roads, no reliable electricity, no school that went past the earliest grades, just mountains, silence, and the particular kind of hardship that seeps into a child's bones before they ever have the words to describe it. His reputation today needs no introduction. El Chapo is a name that has appeared in courtrooms in Brooklyn, on the front pages of every major newspaper in the Western Hemisphere, in congressional hearings and DIA briefings and documentaries and prestige television dramas. He is the man who founded the Sinaloa cartel and turned it into what authorities have called the most powerful drug trafficking organization in history. He is the man who twice escaped from maximum security prisons in Mexico, once in a laundry cart and once through a mile-long tunnel dug directly beneath his cell. He is the man who was eventually extradited to the United States, tried in federal court, convicted on all 10 counts against him, and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. He is currently sitting in Adex Florence in Colorado, the most secure federal facility in America, communicating through letters to courts in New York, requesting that he be allowed to serve his sentence in Mexico. The name El Chapo carries weight the way very few names in the history of organized crime ever have. But every story of that magnitude begins somewhere far smaller. And to understand this particular story, you have to understand a place called Badiraguato. Badiraguato sits in the foothills of the Sierra Madre Occidental, the jagged mountain range that runs along the western spine of Mexico like a spinal column made of stone. The terrain is severe and beautiful in the way that places are when they haven't been touched by development or investment. Steep ridges dropping into narrow river valleys, dense pine forests covering the higher elevations, the kind of geography that makes you feel very small and very far from anything resembling civilization. The municipality covers an enormous area of land, but in terms of population and infrastructure, it has always functioned like an afterthought. Roads were dirt tracks carved into hillsides. Communication with the outside world was minimal. The central government in Mexico City was not a presence you could feel in Badiraguato. It was more of an abstraction, something people heard about, something that occasionally sent soldiers when it needed to assert authority, but never something that manifested as schools or hospitals or economic opportunity. This geographic isolation was not an accident of history. It was the defining feature of life in the region. The rugged terrain that made Badiraguato so difficult to reach also made it nearly impossible to govern. Law enforcement couldn't easily patrol the mountain passes. Federal agencies couldn't monitor valleys that were accessible only on horseback or on foot. What this created, over generations, was a power vacuum, and nature, as it always does, filled that vacuum with whatever was available. In Badiraguato, what was available was a deeply entrenched informal economy built around the cultivation of plants that the outside world wanted very badly and was willing to pay serious money for. The history of drug cultivation in Badiraguato goes back further than most people realize. By the 1930s, opium poppy cultivation had already spread throughout this region of the Sierra Madre, concentrated across municipalities that together formed what would eventually be called Mexico's Golden Triangle, the intersection of Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango states, a name given not for anything precious, but for the extraordinary volume of illicit crops the rugged landscape concealed. The mountains had specific advantages that traffickers recognized early. The valleys where poppies grew were narrow and hidden by the surrounding peaks, making aerial surveillance nearly useless. The isolation that kept poverty locked in also kept law enforcement locked out. By 1948, government surveys identified more than 100 small opium plots in Badiraguato municipality alone. These weren't massive industrial operations. They were family-scale plots, 20 or 30 rows of plants, tended by men, women, and children working together to harvest the raw gum that intermediaries would purchase and move downstream in the chain. Badiraguato was not a poor community that happened to be near a drug-producing region. The 2010 National Census classified it among the 200 most extremely impoverished municipalities in all of Mexico, with 1 in 3 residents living below the threshold for basic nutrition. Marijuana grew across the surrounding hillsides, and yet the community remained hollowed out by scarcity. The money generated by trafficking moved upward through the chain and rarely returned to the people doing the lowest level labor. What remained was a cultural and economic framework in which the drug trade was simply part of life, not a moral crisis, not a shocking revelation, just the economic reality of a place that the legitimate economy had never chosen to reach. This was the world Joaquin Guzum Loera was born into. Not a world of exceptional evil, but a world of exceptional abandonment. And it is inside that abandoned world where the first warning signs began to take shape. His family's circumstances were entirely representative of what most households in the region experienced. His father, Emilio Guzmán Bustillos worked as a cattle rancher on a small scale and cultivated crops to sustain the family. By most accounts, he also grew poppy plants, a detail that, again, was not unusual in a community where poppy cultivation had been normalized for generations. Joaquin was one of at least 10 children, one of the younger members in a large household operating on resources that stretched desperately thin across a great many mouths. There was no path to education beyond the earliest grades. There was no infrastructure that could deliver opportunity to the door of a family like this one. The daily reality was work and scarcity, and the particular fatigue that comes from both. But here's where things get complicated. Because the poverty alone, as crushing as it was, does not by itself explain what Joaquin Guzmán would eventually become. Millions of children have grown up in poverty. Millions of families across Mexico and throughout Latin America have faced the same scarcity, the same geographic isolation, the same lack of educational opportunity. Poverty creates desperation, but it does not automatically create criminal masterminds. The warning signs that matter more specifically in this story were the ones happening inside the home, behind closed doors, in the daily interactions that shape a child's understanding of power and safety and what it means to be vulnerable. His father, by multiple accounts, was physically abusive. This was not a minor detail, not a footnote in the biography of a man who would go on to bigger and more notorious things. This was a foundational experience that researchers who study early childhood development and criminal behavior consistently identify as one of the most significant risk factors for later violent conduct. When a child grows up in a home where the person who is supposed to protect them is also the source of their greatest danger, something happens to their understanding of authority. Trust becomes a liability. Weakness becomes something to eliminate. Control over your environment, over your circumstances, over the people around you, becomes not just desirable, but psychologically necessary. Young Joaquin reportedly sought refuge with other relatives, including his grandfather, creating a pattern of finding protection and loyalty outside the immediate household, a behavioral template that would echo loudly in his adult organizational style. There are reports that even as a young child, he was fiercely protective of his siblings, willing to step between them and their father's violence. This detail is often passed over quickly in broader accounts of his life, but it is enormously significant. A child who learns early that the only protection available is the kind you create for yourself and extend to the people you care about is a child learning, at an extraordinarily young age, the logic of the criminal organization. You build loyalty. You protect your people. You make yourself indispensable. You never let anyone see you as weak. He was learning these lessons before he was 10 years old, inside a home with a dirt floor in the mountains of Sinaloa. The poverty deepened those lessons. By early adolescence, children in households like his were expected to contribute economically to the family's survival. This was not unusual. It was the norm. Young Joaquin worked, helping with agricultural labor, reportedly selling oranges at market, doing whatever work the landscape and the season provided. These were not the experiences of a sheltered childhood. These were the experiences of someone being pushed into adult economic reality long before they had the cognitive tools to fully process it. But they were also experiences that built something. They built an understanding of work, of production, of what it took to move something from one place to another and convert it into money. They built patience. They built a tolerance for physical difficulty and a hatred of the kind of circumstances that made such difficulty necessary. And all around him, as he was absorbing these lessons, was a world that offered a very clear picture of the only economy that seemed to work. The poppy fields weren't hidden in Badiraguato. The marijuana cultivation wasn't a secret. These were open features of the landscape, as normal as the cattle his father raised. Neighboring families cultivated crops. Community members participated in the transport and sale of harvested product. The intermediaries who purchased raw opium gum were known figures in the local social structure. The drug trade wasn't something that existed in the shadows in Badiraguato. It was threaded through the ordinary fabric of life so completely that it was indistinguishable from it. For a child watching all of this, the moral framework that might exist in a different environment simply didn't apply here. This wasn't crime. This was how people fed their families. This was the only reliable economy in a place that the legitimate economy had never chosen to enter. By around the age of 15, Guzum made a transition that represented one of the clearest early warning signs of where his trajectory was heading. He reportedly moved beyond the legitimate agricultural work he'd been doing and began cultivating marijuana and opium poppies of his own, working alongside cousins in the same hills and valleys where this activity had been practiced for decades. This moment, a teenager making the decision to step formally into the illicit economy, was not a sudden break from everything around him. It was a logical extension of everything his environment had taught him. The soil grew it. The community sold it. The money was real in a way that almost nothing else in Badiraguato was real. The decision was, in its context, almost obvious, but what distinguished him from the many other teenagers making similar decisions in similar circumstances was what he brought to it. Because the warning sign wasn't just that he entered the drug trade. Plenty of young men from Badiraguato entered the drug trade and remained low-level participants their entire lives, grinding out a modest existence just slightly better than farming. The warning sign was who he was when he did it. People who knew him in those early years consistently described a particular quality that set him apart, an unusual combination of ambition, patience, and observational intelligence that didn't match his age or his situation. He wasn't reckless in the way that young men often are when they're trying to prove something. He watched. He learned. He paid attention to how things worked at every level, not just the level immediately in front of him. He wanted to understand the whole system, not just his piece of it. He was resourceful in ways that went beyond the immediate problem. He was disciplined in his relationships, cultivating reliability and loyalty at a time when most people his age were still sorting out basic identity. He had, by all accounts, a remarkable memory for people, who they were, what they wanted, what they were afraid of, where their loyalties actually lived. These are not the characteristics of someone who was going to spend his life as a subsistence farmer growing a few rows of poppy plants in the mountains. These are the characteristics of someone building towards something larger, even if neither he nor anyone around him could have named what that was yet. There is a pattern that criminologists have documented across decades of studying how major organized crime figures develop. It almost never involves someone who simply decided one day to become a criminal. It involves someone whose specific combination of traits, ambition, patience, strategic thinking, the ability to manage complex relationships under pressure, was present long before the criminal career began. The traits themselves are not inherently criminal. They are the same traits that produce exceptional business leaders and military commanders. What determines which direction those traits flow is almost entirely a question of environment and available opportunity. In Badiraguato, there was only one environment available, and only one form of opportunity on offer. The traits that might have built something different found their channel in the only direction that was open to them. The warning signs that nobody saw weren't just signs about one individual. They were signs about an entire system. In the late 1970s, the next major turning point arrived in the form of an introduction. One of the first large-scale marijuana traffickers in the region, a man named Pedro Aviles Prez, had pioneered the use of light aircraft to move narcotics across the border into the United States, a leap in operational sophistication that fundamentally changed the scale and economics of Mexican drug trafficking. Avils brought Guzum into his orbit, recognizing in the young man exactly the qualities that the operation needed: reliability, discretion, an ability to follow complex instructions, and an even rarer ability to improve on them. When Avils was killed in a shootout with Mexican authorities in 1978, the network he had built didn't disappear. It fragmented and recombined, with younger and more ambitious figures moving to fill the space he left. Guzum was one of those figures. The transition could have been his end. It was the end for some. Instead, it became his education. Through these years in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Guzum was doing something that would define his entire later career. He was learning logistics. He was learning how to map routes, not just geographic routes through mountains and border crossings, but relationship routes through law enforcement, through corrupt officials, through the networks of trust and payment that allowed product to move from one side of a border to the other without interruption. He worked alongside Dr. Luis Palma Salazar, one of the rising figures in Sinaloa trafficking, helping chart routes and coordinate shipments. He was building a mental library of how this world operated at every level of its hierarchy, a library that would become one of the most valuable assets he possessed. It is also worth acknowledging what the Mexican government was doing during this period. In the late 1970s, Mexico launched Operation Condor, a massive military anti-narcotics campaign that sent 10,000 soldiers sweeping through the Golden Triangle. The campaign eradicated crops and terrorized communities, but it didn't eliminate trafficking. What it did was accelerate its professionalization. The traffickers who survived did so by becoming smarter, more mobile, more compartmentalized, and more deeply embedded in corrupt relationships with the very officials conducting the operation. The lesson for anyone watching was explicit. The state was not a barrier to be stopped by. It was a system to be managed and incorporated. Guzum absorbed that lesson completely. His later organization's notorious expenditure on corruption, reportedly $100 million monthly in bribes, was not an improvisation. It was the logical endpoint of what Operation Condor taught. Then came the defining institutional experience of his criminal development. Miguel Ingel Flix Gallardo, known throughout the underworld as El Padrino, the Godfather, was operating what had become the most sophisticated and powerful drug trafficking organization Mexico had ever seen. The Guadalajara cartel, founded between 1978 and 1980, had done something no previous Mexican trafficking organization had managed. It had professionalized the business. Flix Gallardo, a former federal police officer who had served as a bodyguard to the governor of Sinaloa, understood instinctively that the drug trade was fundamentally a logistics problem, not a gunfight. He didn't present himself as a narco. He wore Italian wool suits and carried leather briefcases. He brokered relationships between drug producers in Colombia and distribution networks in the United States. He created what amounted to a franchise model, dividing Mexico's trafficking territory into administrative zones called plazas, assigning each to a lieutenant responsible for security, logistics, and corruption within their area. By the mid-1980s, Guzum was supervising logistics for this operation. He wasn't sitting at the top of the table yet, but he was inside the room where decisions were being made at a scale that dwarfed anything he had previously encountered. He was watching Flix Gallardo manage relationships with the Medellín cartel in Colombia, manage corrupt officials at multiple levels of the Mexican government, manage the internal politics of an organization that was generating billions of dollars annually while presenting an outwardly unremarkable business face to the world. This was graduate school for organized crime. And Guzman was a student who retained everything. He learned what worked and what didn't. He learned that visibility was a liability, that the most powerful position in any criminal organization was not the most visible one, but the most indispensable one. He learned that corruption wasn't just a tool of convenience, it was a structural requirement, something that had to be systematically maintained across entire layers of government and law enforcement. He learned that diversification was essential, that an organization relying on a single route or a single method was an organization one interdiction away from collapse. He learned that trust inside an organization like this was a currency more valuable than cash, and that cultivating it required time and consistency and the kind of demonstrated reliability that could only come from years of performance. And then the whole operation fell apart. In 1989, Flix Gallardo was arrested. The Guadalajara cartel, the most powerful trafficking organization in Mexican history, began to fracture. Flix Gallardo himself, operating from prison, attempted to manage the breakup by formalizing the division of territory among his various lieutenants. What this created, in practice, was a landscape of newly empowered and intensely competitive regional organizations: the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, the Gulf cartel, and the nascent Sinaloa organization that Guzman, along with figures like Ismael Zambada Garca, known as El Mayo, and Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, known as El Azul, would help bring to dominance. This moment, the collapse of the Guadalajara cartel, was the most consequential turning point in El Chapo's entire criminal career, because it created exactly the kind of opening that a man with his preparation and his particular skill set was positioned to exploit. He hadn't been sitting at the top of the hierarchy. He had been learning, accumulating, observing. Now the hierarchy was gone. Now the question was who had the discipline and the vision and the operational intelligence to build something new from the wreckage. And Guzman had spent the better part of a decade preparing for exactly this kind of moment, even if he hadn't known that was what he was doing. The Sinaloa cartel did not emerge overnight. That's crucial to understand. It was not the product of a single decision or a single year. It was constructed gradually through alliances and rivalries and territorial consolidation and the constant, grinding process of building an organization capable of operating at an international scale. Guzman brought to this construction process everything he had learned, from the mountain villages of Badiraguato, from Pedro Avilsa's smuggling routes, from Flix Gallardo's plaza system, from years of mapping routes and managing shipments and building relationships across the full spectrum of the trafficking ecosystem. What the early years of the Sinaloa organization actually looked like was ugly and uncertain in ways the later mythology tends to obscure. The fragmentation of the Guadalajara cartel didn't produce a clean division of territory. It produced a war. The newly formed Tijuana cartel, run by the Arellano Flix brothers, moved aggressively to contest territory and eliminate rivals. The Juarez cartel, under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who would earn the nickname Lord of the Skies for his use of Boeing 727s to move cocaine, controlled critical border crossings that Guzman needed. Every major trafficking corridor in Mexico was contested, and the men contesting them were not interested in negotiation. Guzman navigated this landscape the way he had navigated every environment before it, by being simultaneously more patient and more ruthless than the people around him. He formed a tight alliance with Ismael Zambada Garca, known as El Mayo, a figure who had been operating in Sinaloa since before either of them had entered the Guadalajara cartel's orbit. El Mayo brought organizational depth and local roots that complemented Guzum's operational genius and his willingness to absorb risk. Together, along with Juan José Esparragosa Moreno, known as El Azul, they formed the core leadership structure of what would eventually become the most powerful trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere. But in the early 1990s, that future was far from guaranteed. One of the pivotal moves in those early years was securing direct relationships with Colombian cocaine producers, bypassing the payment arrangements the Guadalajara cartel had maintained and negotiating independently with suppliers. Where previous arrangements had involved Mexican traffickers accepting cash for moving Colombian product, Guzum pushed for a different model, payment in cocaine itself, which his organization would then sell on its own terms inside the United States. This was not a minor operational adjustment. It was a fundamental restructuring of the economic relationship between Mexican and Colombian trafficking organizations, one that transferred enormous amounts of power and profit northward into Mexican hands and set the financial foundation for the Sinaloa cartel's eventual global dominance. The violence of those founding years was also strategic in a way that distinguished it from the more indiscriminate brutality of rival organizations. Guzum targeted specifically. He prioritized the elimination of people who represented direct threats to his consolidation. He maintained loyalty through a combination of genuine generosity, paying well, protecting families, rewarding reliability over time, and the consistent demonstration that betrayal carried consequences that could not be escaped or negotiated away. This combination of calculated violence and organizational discipline was something he had been building towards since those earliest years in Badiraguato, when he first learned that the only real security came from the loyalty you built yourself. What distinguished the Sinaloa cartel under his leadership from previous organizations wasn't raw violence, though violence was certainly present. What distinguished it was operational sophistication and an almost obsessive focus on logistics and adaptation. Guzum's engineers built tunnels beneath the border that were engineering achievements by any measure. Not simple crawl spaces, but ventilated, lit, rail-equipped passageways capable of moving enormous volumes of product. His organization hid narcotics in chili pepper cans and fire extinguishers and hollowed-out automobile parts. When law enforcement developed methods to identify one concealment technique, his people were already developing the next one. When a route was compromised, alternative routes were already mapped. The organization operated in compartments, with different cells carrying different pieces of the operation and no single point of failure capable of bringing down the whole structure. And here's something that becomes clear when you trace back through his history. Every one of these approaches has a precedent in something he learned or experienced before his name meant anything internationally. The tunnel systems echo the mountain terrain of Badiraguato, where the natural landscape itself was the primary concealment strategy, where geography did the work that tunnels would later do. The compartmentalized operations echo the plaza system Flix Gallardo taught him, refined and adapted. The obsession with backup routes and contingency planning echoes the survival mentality of a child who grew up in a household where safety was never guaranteed, and escape plans were a psychological necessity. The emphasis on loyalty, enforced with extreme thoroughness and rewarded with unusual generosity, echoes a boy who learned that the people you could actually trust were the ones you built relationships with yourself, not the ones assigned to you by circumstance. His childhood didn't just influence his criminal career. In many ways, it created the blueprint for it. The warning signs, examined in retrospect, form a pattern that is almost uncomfortably coherent. Consider them together. A child born into extreme poverty in one of the most isolated regions of Mexico, with no meaningful access to education or legal economic opportunity. A father who was physically abusive, creating a home environment defined by unpredictability, fear, and the constant necessity of self-protection. A community where drug cultivation was so normalized that it was indistinguishable from ordinary agricultural activity. An early exposure to the economics and logistics of trafficking through the family's own participation. A personality marked by unusual ambition, patience, and observational intelligence in a context where those qualities had almost no legitimate outlet. An early decision, by mid-adolescence, to enter the illicit economy formally. A series of increasingly sophisticated criminal apprenticeships that built knowledge and capability at every level of the trafficking hierarchy. And then a structural collapse, the dismantling of the organization he had served, that cleared the space for him to build something of his own. None of these factors was unique to him. Others from Badiraguato experienced the same poverty. Others had abusive fathers. Others grew up surrounded by marijuana and poppy cultivation. Others entered the drug trade young. What was unique was the combination, the specific constellation of circumstances, environment, personality, and timing that converged in this particular person at this particular moment. Understanding that combination doesn't excuse anything. It doesn't reduce the weight of the violence that the Sinaloa cartel carried out across decades, the lives destroyed, the communities corrupted, the institutions hollowed out. But understanding it is essential to understanding how criminal organizations of this scale actually come into being. They don't emerge from nowhere. They grow from specific soil. Badiraguato has continued to produce major cartel figures across multiple generations. El Chapo was not an anomaly of his community. He was its most extreme expression. Researchers consistently point to the same structural factors. Extreme poverty with no credible path out through legitimate means. Geographic isolation that prevents state institutions from functioning. An entrenched informal economy in which trafficking has been a feature for more than a century. And a cultural normalization that follows when something has been present long enough to simply become part of the landscape. These are not conditions that produce one criminal in one generation. These are conditions that produce criminal economies that persist and reconstitute themselves regardless of who is arrested or killed or extradited. The transformation from the boy selling oranges in the mountains of Sinaloa to the man commanding one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in human history was not the product of some sudden and dramatic radicalization. It was the product of a long and almost perfectly logical progression through a set of environments that rewarded exactly the skills he happened to have and punished the absence of exactly the protections he had never possessed. Every step made sense in the context of the step before it. Every choice was rational inside the world he was operating in. The problem was that the world he was operating in had been constructed over generations to make these choices almost inevitable for someone with his particular profile. And when the world is built that way, when the architecture of poverty and isolation and institutional failure is that deeply embedded individual warnings about individual people can't do much. The structure itself is the warning. The structure itself is what nobody saw. The scale of what he eventually built is genuinely difficult to comprehend. The Sinaloa cartel moved cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana into dozens of countries, establishing distribution networks in American cities from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York. Its operations generated revenues experts estimated in the billions annually, numbers that put it in the range of many Fortune 500 companies. He accumulated wealth and influence on a scale that had no precedent in the history of Mexican organized crime. And he did it while remaining, for decades, one of the most difficult people in the world to capture. The prison escapes became the most famous episodes of his career, precisely because they illustrated something anyone who had paid attention to his history could have recognized. The laundry cart escape in 2001, the tunnel dug beneath his cell at the Altiplano prison in 2015, these were not improvisations. They were the product of the same methodical, patient mind that had spent decades thinking about how to move things from one place to another without being caught. The underlying logic: identify the weakness in the system, build the infrastructure to exploit it, execute with precision, was identical to every trafficking operation he had ever run. And that logic had its roots in Badiraguato, in a boy who learned very early that survival required you to build your own infrastructure of safety and escape. He spent his entire adult life doing exactly what the mountains taught him. He just did it on an incomprehensibly larger scale. Bringing it all together, the warning signs were never one dramatic event. There was no single moment where someone could have looked at young Joaquin Guzman and said, definitively, this child will one day lead a criminal empire. The warning signs were distributed across years and environments and circumstances, each one individually deniable, each one only comprehensible in relation to the others. The childhood trauma that rewired his relationship with authority and trust. The poverty that stripped away every alternative and made the illicit economy feel like the only rational choice. The environment that normalized criminal activity so completely it ceased to register as criminal at all. The personality that was built for exactly the kind of sustained, patient, adaptive work that building an international criminal organization requires. The apprenticeships that turned raw capability into sophisticated operational knowledge. And the structural collapse that cleared the field for someone of his preparation to build something entirely his own. Each of these was a warning sign. Together, they were a blueprint. History tends to remember El Chapo in a particular way, as the dramatic fugitive, the tunnel builder, the man who walked out of 2 maximum security prisons, the cartel boss whose trial in a Brooklyn federal courtroom became the most consequential drug trafficking prosecution in American history. That version of the story is true as far as it goes. He is all of those things. The conviction in 2019, the sentence of life without the possibility of parole, the current confinement in the most secure cell in the United States, these are the facts of how the story ended for him. But what that version of the story consistently misses is the beginning. And without the beginning, the rest of it is just spectacle. A series of remarkable events without any root, any cause, any context that might tell us something useful about how the world actually works. El Chapo's story is not just the story of one man's choices. It's the story of what happens when a child is born into a specific intersection of poverty, violence, isolation, and institutional abandonment that has been producing the same outcome for generations. It's the story of what happens when the characteristics that, in a different environment, might have built something constructive are instead channeled, through circumstance and necessity, into building something that eventually destroys enormous amounts of what it touches. The warning signs were there. They were in the mountains of Badiraguato, in the dirt floors of La Tuna, in the terror of a father's violence and the adaptation that terror required. They were in the poppy fields and the normalization and the absence of anything legitimate that could compete. They were in the ambition of a teenage boy who looked at his circumstances and decided, with complete clarity, that he was not going to stay in them. Very few people saw any of this at the time. Very few people were looking. And by the time the world finally understood what had been built in those mountains over all those years, the consequences had already spread across borders and generations and entire nations. That is what makes his rise not just a criminal story, but one of the most consequential criminal transformations of the modern era. And it's why, even now, with El Chapo sitting in a Colorado supermax and writing letters to courts about returning to Mexico to serve his time, the world he helped build continues operating without him, because the warning signs that nobody saw for him are still there, still embedded in the same mountains, the same poverty, the same absence, producing the same outcome in the generation that came after.